Well, thank you for joining us today, Jaclyn. Start by telling us who you are and what you do as a professor who focuses on workplace wellness.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here and thrilled to be chatting with you as a fan of the podcast. So, I'm a professor of applied behavioral science at Pepperdine University's Graziadio Business School. I'm also a department chair there for the Behavioral Science and Organizational Theory department. So, what I love to focus on and my bread and butter is teaching students about professional development and employee well-being, and I primarily teach our MBA students. I also do research and writing on topics such as exhaustion, collaboration overload, social comparisons, and leadership.
I think I've said this before on the podcast, but I feel like in another life, that's the job I want. I think it would be so cool to like focus on this research and I feel like I talk to a lot of experts who have done the research and then they come and they share it. And I just think it would be fascinating to be on the other side. So you're having my like alter ego's career. I love that. That's so cool.
It is really cool. I am a huge fan of school, and if I could be a student forever, I would. And this is kind of the flip side where I still get to be a student and learning and discovering new knowledge all the time. So I can't imagine doing anything else, although it's pretty cool what you get to do also.
Yeah, I know. It's so we just have to merge our two jobs together. Uh,
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, so tell me, what does it really mean when we say workplace wellness? This has become a buzzword that you see everywhere, but what does it actually mean? I'm sure as a expert on this, you're like, everyone's getting this wrong.
Yeah, well, workplace wellness isn't actually a research term. It's more of a catch-all that we use to encompass a lot of different characteristics. So I think there's power in the fact that we're talking about it a lot. Um, the fact that we care about how people are doing as individuals in addition to their performance is something that's really wonderful. But I think the reason that we're hearing it everywhere is because we saw people's workplace wellness suffer starting with the pandemic and onwards. And one of my favorite ways that I like to explain it is that if you imagine a Jenga tower, if you've ever played Jenga before, and all of the pieces that are in it contribute to our wellness. So it's things like having a supportive culture at work, having a great leader, having the support at home or the family care that you need in order to do well and be engaged and be happy at work. But what we saw during the pandemic is that those pieces from the Jenga tower started to get removed, and our tower of workplace wellness became more and more precarious. And so, a lot of times when we're talking about workplace wellness, we're contrasting it with employees not doing great, not feeling great, and perhaps even being burnt out.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say it's not really a like a research term, it's a catch-all, but it's the catch-all because wellness, as you pointed out, is a lot of different things. And
Right,
oftentimes I think that people want to hear if you just did more of this thing, your workplace wellness would fix it, right? But it's so
exactly.
unique and individual to each person, it sounds like.
It is absolutely. We know a number of things that contribute to workplace wellness, or on the flip side, contribute to burnout. But it is a lot of figuring out what works to you. One of probably the most frustrating things that I say in my class to students is it depends, because a lot of it is dependent on who the person is and the environment that they're in. And there is no equation. I wish there was this really
I
simple
know.
equation, but there isn't. It's very complex and it's very individualistic.
I also find it interesting that we started to focus on this kind of like COVID brought it to light, but like workplace wellness should have been important years before that too. Like parents were working before COVID and struggling. Like I saw someone on LinkedIn the other day and she had this post and it was like, I'm sorry to all the parents who I said you still had to come to the 8 a.m. meeting, not understanding how hard and like almost impossible it is to get somewhere by 8 a.m. when you have to drop your kids off and all that. And she was saying now that she's a parent, she understands it. And it's just sort of like, I feel like the positive part of COVID is it brought a lot of this to the surface and more of a focus on it. But it's not like these things didn't exist before. They're not brand new.
They definitely have always existed. But the fascinating thing in you saying that is I've been teaching these courses for 10 years or so now. And you can imagine sometimes when you teach MBA students, especially those who are really interested in the numbers and that side of it, it's hard to convince them to talk about the touchy-feely side of business. And 10 years ago, I would have to spend the whole first class session kind of convincing students about the importance of people at work And now when I start my classes, people are already talking about this. I don't have to convince them it's important. It's important. So there definitely has been what I consider an incredibly good shift to this being the forefront of the conversation rather than the background of the conversation where it's kind of hidden in the shadows. We know how important having good and empowered and satisfied people is. And now it's businesses themselves also trying to figure it out. So you're right, that it's always been there. It's just kind of snuck out from behind the curtain a little bit more, which is awesome.
Yes, it's definitely awesome. Okay, what are the signs of burnout and the different types of burnout that exist out there?
Sure, that's a really important question because part of the problem in that we're talking about this more is that we often use the same word to mean multiple different things. So this is a word that is technical in in the regard that it has been used in research. So I'll refer to that definition. In the 1970s, Christina Maslach and her colleagues began to study burnout. And they have a pretty famous measure that has largely stood the test of time because it's still being used and shown to be um, relevant today. And so burnout is thought to be a result of three factors. And so these are the three things that you can keep an eye out for to really see, am I experiencing burnout or am I experiencing something else? So the first is emotional exhaustion. This has to do with being drained and depleted by your work. This is different than just being tired. Most of us get tired throughout the day and throughout the week, but we're able to recover from it. But exhaustion is something deeper. It's when that feeling of tiredness just does not go away. So, one of the greatest examples that I've heard is by a professor who went on vacation because he was feeling exhausted. And when he came back, instead of being rejuvenated, the exhaustion just hit him again. And so, it's that sense of drained that won't go away. So, that's the first one, emotional exhaustion. The second is cynicism about your work. So this is when you depersonalize what you're doing. You have a general detachment from your job. A lot of the earliest research in burnout was in the medical field, and this context can provide a really powerful example. Burned out doctors would be those who would start seeing their patients as numbers or cases rather than people. And obviously, that's not what we want, right? As a doctor, you don't want to have that view. And as a patient, you don't want your doctor to have that view. But in general, cynicism is that detachment from the impact of what you're doing. And then finally, the third component is when you start to doubt your own abilities, you doubt your own competence. Signs that you're experiencing this is when you're wondering, can I accomplish this? You begin to have what they call a sense or a lack of personal accomplishment. So those are the three components that we really talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like the first one I think of as maybe the most common where you're feeling really tired. So you're like, oh, I'm so tired all the time. I just need like a weekend to rest or where I need no
Right.
plans or, I need to not work 80 hours a week. I need to cut back to 40. And you're saying like sometimes that's not the answer.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because we're talking about taking a mental health day. Which of these does a mental health day help and which of these will a mental health day not cure at all?
I love this question so much. So, some of the most interesting research on burnout that is coming out, and the current research or a current research project that I'm working on, focuses on measuring burnout from day to day. And so, these studies are called diary studies. And essentially, what we do is we'll survey someone every day to measure their levels of burnout. And what we find is that about 30% of burnout can change from day to day. So the glass half empty perspective is that a lot of burnout is hard to change. It's structural factors, institutional factors that are going to take a while to change. So, for instance, we know that a lot of doctors experience burnout because their jobs, they have a lot of demands and not a lot of control over what happens. And so you can imagine that's really difficult to change. But the glass half full perspective is that up to 30%, or perhaps more, or a little bit less, depending on who you are, can change from day to day. And if somebody were to tell me you can feel 30% better tomorrow, I'm like, sign me up. That's great news that there is the possibility for some small changes along with the bigger, longer term changes that we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe a mental health day is the answer for some people.
It depends what you do with that mental health day and why you're taking it, right? If you're taking the mental health day and expecting that you're going to come back and all of your problems are going to be gone, it's probably going to set yourself up for failure. But if you take a mental health day and figure out what can I do in order to really relax and enjoy this and get the most of it so that I can come back feeling recharged, that's probably going to set you up for a lot more success.
So, what are the best practices for taking a mental health day that actually does help you recharge?
Yeah, and this gets back to that it depends comment that I like to frustrate people with. It's finding something that's a good fit for you. And some great places to start are figuring out what energizes you and what doesn't. And I know this sounds really basic, but a lot of times we don't do this. We'll just take a mental health day and sit there binging Netflix. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. But a lot of times we need something that's actually going to restore us and rejuvenate us. And a lot of ways, there has been a lot of research into this concept of work recovery. And this gets at this idea of how do we recover from the stresses of work? How do we metaphorically refill our gas tank when it's feeling empty? And sometimes this is just generally relaxation, again, the Netflix, but there are other things that we can do that can help us refill in better or different ways at different times. Those are things like doing something that you feel masterful over that is different than your work. So, for instance, if you really are trying to learn tennis and you love tennis, that can be focusing on that so you can feel a sense of accomplishment over something that's different from work. Another example is just to detach from your work. So, too many people will take a day off from work, but say, I don't want to be completely out of the loop. So, they'll still be checking their email. And we know that feeling a sense of psychological detachment from work is incredibly important in order to recover. So things that I like to do are ones where I can't be looking at my phone. So for instance, my daughter and I will go in the pool because we cannot take our phones. Well, she doesn't have a phone yet, but I cannot take my phone in the pool. So that forces me to be present in the moment and actually stop thinking about work. But again, you have to figure out what works for you. To give you a silly example that I share with my students is I have so many nature allergies that I'm still working on figuring out the balance. And so if I try to go hiking on my mental health day, I end up feeling worse and worse because that's not currently working for me. And again, that's like an incredibly silly example, but finding that fit with what truly recharges your soul is really important and often takes some self-reflection.
Yeah, I think my favorite mental health days from work are setting OOs because then I feel like I don't have this pressure to check my email or
Yep.
anything like that. Giving people a heads up ahead of time. So I'm not a spontaneous mental health day person, but some people are. I try to pick a quiet day. I try to do the OO. And then I love like errands and organization. It's sort of like a
Yes.
life catch up day. And that energizes me because I'm like, all these things that were on my to-do list or that
Oh God.
closet that's been a mess forever, I think it goes back to one of your things of like I have control over it and I get a sense of
Yes.
mastery and completion. And I know that fills me up. I love a good Netflix binge, but I know like now that I've started to like pay attention to it, I'm like that will fill me up so much more. So it's interesting you talk about this workplace recovery because I do think ultimately taking a mental health day at work, I do think is the most successful when it is adding some recovery and not just like that blah feeling. And I think of like
Yes.
watching TV is like that blah feeling. And it's nice to like turn off your brain for a couple hours and enter the Netflix world. But be honest, you're probably still scrolling Instagram on your phone, checking something on your computer. It's almost like for
Right.
me, the mental health day has to like take me away from the actual work of the screen or something like that.
Absolutely. And I love that you talked about the feeling control because that's an incredible way to recover from work. I actually have an app on my phone where I track my moods. I have my students do this, which is why I do it as well in certain classes. You track your activities and your moods so that you can get an idea of what really works for you. And I am someone who loves a good Netflix binge. And so when I was doing this, what I was realizing is that the first hour for me is really enjoyable just to get that relaxation in.
Yeah.
But then that second hour, I start to feel blue and down and just kind of that blah feeling. And so once you start to understand what works for you, you can also create a plan. So for me, if I'm taking a mental health day, the first hour after I drop off my daughter, I might watch a show that I want to catch up on before I start going into my other activities. So understanding what works for you and how you can get that mastery or that control or that detachment or that relaxation is really critical.
I remember too reading an article, it was by Adam Grant, and it talked about attention residue and how you
Hmm.
can't have your attention switch between things too quickly because there's sort of this like residue
Yep.
that needs to wear off before you can then clearly go into the next thing. So it's actually really smart for like that's why they say in work, like work, take a 20-minute break or a 10-minute break between tasks, or watch that TV show in the afternoon before you start whatever nighttime activity. It's like you need like the physical space, and now there's actual research to back that up as well, which is really interesting. How do you,
Definitely.
how do you recommend that people communicate their need to take a mental health day with their boss and their coworkers? Because I think also, even though workplace wellness is becoming something we're all like, it's part of our conversation. Our bosses, I think, do want to be supportive, but it can still feel a little taboo to be like, I need a mental health day, right?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a tricky question. One of the unfortunate realities that I share with students all the time is that what is true and what I wish was true are still two different things. So I wish that everyone you work with would be incredibly supportive when you told them that you need a mental health day, because it's not only good for you, but it's also good for your work in the long term. But a lot of people still don't get that. Some people are going to be supportive, but others won't. So when figuring out what to say, the first question is to ask if you need a reason. Sometimes we over explain. If you just put in for PTO, some people will approve it, and it's your business whether or not you want to share. But if you have somewhere where you have to give a reason, it's really understanding how your boss reacts and how you're going to be able to communicate it. So if you have a boss who's incredibly supportive, who listens to your podcast, who understands the benefits of these things, you can probably tell them, like, I just need to recharge my energy. If they don't, it's probably figuring out a way to take a planned mental health day in a way that works. So you might not want to plan it for the busiest time of year. You might want to plan it ahead of time and make sure that you're getting your work done beforehand so that you can say something like, hey, I'm taking this day off next Monday. Here's how I'm going to get my work done ahead of time, and give as much information as is going to make your boss comfortable without feeling the need to overshare.
Yeah, I would just add also for people listening, whatever you say you're going to do, do it. So if you say you're going to take a mental health day, you've prepped ahead of time, you
Yes,
have that don't check email. Don't teach them
right,
that you don't actually you set boundaries, but you don't respect your own boundaries. I
right,
would say set your boundary and respect it. It's one day. If they truly do need you in an emergency, they probably have your phone and they can call you. And so I also feel like part of the success of mental health days is like I can't get in my own head about it. I can't make it a weird thing. And I have to go about it in a way that makes me comfortable. And then I just have to let it be. And I feel like it's one of those muscles of like discomfort. But the more you do it, the more you're like, okay, that wasn't so bad. Like nobody died. Like nothing weird
right,
happened. Nobody was mad. No, like, and also not to read into it too much, like, oh my gosh, she's totally judging me for taking it. And it's like,
right.
maybe they're actually a little envious because they would like to do that too or something. That's just like as I've learned from other people on the podcast, that's something I've learned is also important, is sort of like set your boundary and then stick with it too, because you teach them
Totally.
how to teach or how to treat you as you go on. I want to circle back to the burn. We talked about the three types of burnout. If
Sure.
you are experiencing those things in work, what's the solution? I mean, it feels like a mental health day is not gonna cut it, right? You've got cynicism, you are having exhaustion to the point where like a nap isn't gonna fix it. What do you recommend at that point?
That's a great and tough question. And so it's a two-tiered approach. The first is making those short-term changes so that you can start to see some benefits. Again, your burnout isn't going to feel the same every day. And so if you start being compassionate towards yourself, compassionate towards others, seeking support, taking control of what you can, that's going to help. It's not going to solve it, but that's going to help. And then the second part, which is the much slower, harder part, is figuring out how to make bigger changes that can fix the environment that you're in. You're giving one great example of drawing the correct boundaries and figuring out how to do that in your world. And that will help you take more control over what you're doing, which ultimately can help alleviate burnout. A lot of times it's figuring out how to get in the right role or conduct your role in a way that gives you a feeling of control while also having a sense of the demands and a community of support that will allow you to succeed. And that can be anything from just working with your current manager to on the extreme, looking for a job where you're in a different culture or a different community. So it's that two-pronged approach where you want to do those short-term fixes that can help you. And often a mental health day can put you on the path, but it's not going to solve the problem. Whereas the other one are the longer-term solutions that do take time, do take energy, and ultimately is based on if you see progress over time, and if not, what are some more substantial changes that you can make then.
Yeah, it's almost like in the short term, if you're feeling exhausted, like exhaustion, extreme burnout, you could take the mental health day to start thinking about go to the beach and you sit at the ocean and you just think about
Yes,
what is it I'm going to do? How am I truly going to make some changes in my life? Like that isn't going to obviously the next day you wake up and everything's different, but it's a first step in the right direction. The other
exactly.
thing I was thinking too is for me, sometimes work is the easier part of the day and there's life stuff
Mm-hmm.
that is really actually the thing that's causing more burnout. Childcare is obviously a big one that people talk about, but there are also other things in your life. We had a woman come on one day or one time to talk about time management, and she
Mm-hmm.
mentioned something about like buying your time, and I always remember
Yes,
that as like a big piece of burnout for people. Sometimes they want to do it all and they don't have literally enough hours in the day, but could you delegate some of those things to other people? Obviously, that's, we're talking about, being in a privileged financial position where you could do that. But I just mean, sometimes I feel like the burnout isn't always necessarily coming from work, but work is the thing that
totally.
gets a lot of attention for it, right? It's
Attention.
almost like maybe if I change work, then this burnout will go away. But the problem is you have to understand where your burnout is really originating from. Does that make sense?
Oh, it completely makes sense. Yeah, we talked, burnout was originally discussed in the workplace and it has since then gone to other places. And Ashley Willens out of Harvard and Cassie Holmes, who I believe you interviewed on your podcast before, they do incredible research about understanding how we structure our days and our lives. And you were talking about how having privilege to buy yourself out of some activities is really incredible. But even on the margins, when we make changes, we can buy ourselves out of some things that can cause us a lot of distress. So one of the studies that I love is they gave people $40 and said, spend it on yourself. And they found that the people, I'm probably misquoting this a little bit, but the general idea was that the people who spent it on activities to buy themselves out of something ended up being happier than those who spent it on themselves. So the people, for instance, who didn't like cooking dinner and spent it on buying dinner from their family would experience this boost in happiness that lasted longer than if you spent it on shoes for yourself. And
Yeah.
of course, you have to figure out the balance that's right for you. But when I read research like that, what it does is validate this idea that finding what's not bringing you satisfaction and figuring out ways to work around it can be really powerful. And that you're right, that's not always at work. That tends to be what I focus on is work, but we also have people who focus on mothers who feel burnout or people who feel burnout in other areas of their life. So that's an incredibly important caveat that I'm so happy you brought up.
Yeah, and even moms deserve a mental health day. I think it's interesting when we think of
Yes.
mental health days. When I was a kid growing up, my mom believed in mental health days. You could wake
Yeah.
up and tell her, I just really do not feel like going to school today. And like, you couldn't like abuse the system, but like she believed in mental health days
Yes.
for us as kids and her herself, I know it's easier said than done, but I just want to put this out there. It's like mental health days, everyone's allowed them. There's no rule that you have to be, quote unquote employee of a workplace to get them. Okay, I want to wrap up because obviously you're a workplace psychologist, and I want you to share your top three wellness habits that you follow or rituals or routines that you really love.
Oh, that's
I know it's a big one.
a tough question. And I'll couch this by saying that I like to vary what I do. There's a lot of evidence that if we do something too much, it becomes part of what we're expecting to do rather than something novel that boosts a change in us. So I'll say it very generally. One of the things that I think is the most important habit is doing something for yourself. So that can be going for a walk, reading a book, getting your nails done, whatever brings you some energy and joy. The second thing I would say is my second habit that I love to do is to do something for someone else. I'm a big fan of writing cards or sending small trinkets and gifts or even just calling someone who I haven't talked to in a while, then also helping people who reach out to me. So doing something for yourself, doing something for someone else. And then third, doing something to make a longer term or bigger impact. That's really variable from person to person, but trying to figure out what it is. So I think those are my non-committal top three wellness habits, figuring out how to do something for yourself, do something for someone else, and doing something to make a bigger impact.
I love it. I'll take it. I totally relate to if you do something too often, then you're expected to it. You know, once you have kids, your life is very routine, mostly
Yes.
because it makes life easier to be really routine also, and they thrive on it. But like last Tuesday, we just randomly went to dinner instead of cooking, and it was like I can't even tell you how
Yes.
happy I was. Like we went to CPK. It was not fancy, nothing
Yes.
crazy out of the ordinary. It was still like 5 o'clock, you know, but it
Right.
was like, wow, we broke our routine on a Tuesday night. This is so thrilling, you know? It was just
Right.
really funny, like the energy you get. Someone told me this once too, like back when I was commuting to work, they were saying if you just take like a different commute to work, it can like really
Hmm.
re-energize you because you start to do those things on autopilot. So I love that you said that because I have personally experienced that. And let me tell you guys, it's a thrill. So,
Yes. Yes.
um,
Absolutely.
okay, well, Jaclyn, thank you so much for sharing these tips. I think it gives everyone a lot of confidence in not just to ask for the mental health day, but what to do with their mental health day to really recharge. I think this concept of workplace recovery is so important. So thank you for coming on the show to share it with us today. Where can people find you, follow you if they want to keep tabs on your work?
Oh, sure. I have a little Instagram account that I don't post as much as I would like to on called the Workplace PhD.
I love it. Actually, that's where I found you, and you post a lot, and it's all really good stuff. And so, everyone at Workplace PhD, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.